Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you never saw betrayal coming? Have you ever wondered at what point a joke stops being funny and becomes something darker? Something that permanently alters the foundation of a relationship you thought was unshakable? I'm about to share with you the most terrifying, painful, and ultimately transformative experience of my life, and I need you to understand something from the very beginning. This isn't just a story about a prank gone wrong. This is a story about trust, about boundaries, about the invisible lines we draw in our relationships, and what happens when someone we love crosses them without a second thought. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what does matter is that I'm someone who always believed family came first, who always gave second chances, who always laughed along even when the joke was on me. I was that person who prided myself on being easygoing, on rolling with the punches, on being the cool sibling who could take a joke. But there's a difference between taking a joke and becoming the punchline of something that could have killed you. And I learned that difference in the most brutal way possible on a sunny Tuesday afternoon that started like any other day but ended with me strapped to a gurney, struggling to breathe, with paramedics hovering over me asking questions I couldn't answer because my throat was closing up and my heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst right through my chest. This is the story of how my brother Jake's idea of humor sent me to the emergency room, how I woke up to a medical bill that could have bankrupted me, and how I made the decision that would tear our family apart but ultimately taught me the most valuable lesson about self-respect and accountability I've ever learned. I'm telling you this story not for sympathy, not for validation, though I won't lie and say those things don't help when you're questioning every decision you've made, but because I believe that somewhere out there, someone needs to hear this. Someone needs to know that it's okay to set boundaries even with the people you love, especially with the people you love. Because love without respect is just a word we use to excuse behavior we'd never tolerate from strangers. Growing up, Jake was always the golden child, and I don't say that with bitterness anymore. Though there was a time when that observation came wrapped in layers of resentment and hurt that I didn't know how to process. He was 3 years older than me, which in childhood terms meant he was infinitely cooler, infinitely more experienced, infinitely more everything I aspired to be. Our parents adored him, and why wouldn't they? Jake was charismatic in that effortless way some people are, like he was born knowing exactly what to say and when to say it, how to make people laugh, how to command a room without seeming like he was trying. He was athletic, popular, the kind of kid who made friends as easily as breathing, while I was quieter, more bookish, the kind of kid who preferred reading in corners to playing sports in the yard. The dynamic between us was complicated in the way sibling relationships often are. There was love there, genuine love, but it was tangled up with competition and comparison, and this unspoken hierarchy where Jake's wants and needs and jokes always seemed to take priority over mine. He was the prankster of the family, always had been, and I have memories stretching back to early childhood of him hiding my toys, jumping out to scare me, putting salt in my orange juice, all the classic big brother moves that our parents laughed off as harmless fun, as boys being boys, as Jake just having a good time. And I went along with it because that's what you do when you're the younger sibling, when you want to be included, when you're desperate for any attention from the brother you idolize even as he makes you the butt of every joke. His pranks evolved as we got older, becoming more elaborate, more public, more designed to get maximum laughs from his friends at my expense. But I kept laughing along because I didn't know how else to be, because setting boundaries felt like admitting I couldn't take a joke. And in our family, not being able to take a joke was the worst possible thing you could be. The pattern continued into our adult lives, even after we'd both moved out of our parents' house and started building our own separate existences. Jake became a sales manager at a tech company, married his college girlfriend Sarah, bought a house in the suburbs with a 2-car garage and a golden retriever named Max. I went a different route, got a degree in graphic design, worked freelance from my small apartment downtown, dated occasionally but never seriously, lived a quieter life that suited me perfectly, even if it didn't look as impressive on paper as Jake's picture-perfect existence. We still saw each other regularly, family dinners every Sunday at our parents' place, occasional brother-sister lunches when Jake claimed he missed me and wanted to catch up, though these meetups almost always involved some kind of prank or practical joke that left me feeling smaller and stupider, while Jake laughed and told me I was too sensitive when I didn't find it as funny as he did. Our parents continued to enable this dynamic, continued to wave away my complaints with the same tired phrases they'd been using since we were children. That's just how Jake is. He doesn't mean anything by it. You know he loves you. Why do you have to make such a big deal out of everything? Can't you just learn to laugh at yourself? And I internalized those messages so deeply that I started to believe maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe if I could just relax and stop taking everything so seriously, then our relationship would be perfect and I'd finally feel like I belonged in this family that seemed to speak a language I'd never quite mastered. I didn't realize then that I was slowly eroding my own boundaries, teaching Jake and everyone else that my comfort, my feelings, my basic sense of safety and dignity were all negotiable in service of keeping the peace and maintaining this facade of the happy, joking, easygoing family we all pretended to be. The day everything changed started so ordinarily that the contrast still haunts me in those moments right before sleep when my brain insists on replaying every detail in high definition. It was a Tuesday in late September, one of those perfect autumn days where the air has just the slightest chill, and the leaves are starting to turn those brilliant shades of red and gold that make you remember why people write poems about fall. I'd been working on a logo design for a new client all morning, lost in that productive flow state where hours pass like minutes, and I'd just finished a version I was actually proud of when my phone buzzed with a text from Jake asking if I wanted to grab lunch at this new burger place that had opened near my apartment. I should have been suspicious. Jake didn't usually suggest lunch in my neighborhood. He usually expected me to come to him. But I was hungry and tired of staring at my computer screen and honestly, just happy that my brother wanted to spend time with me without it being a family obligation. I texted back yes, threw on a jacket, and walked the 3 blocks to the restaurant, enjoying the sunshine and the crunch of early fallen leaves under my feet, and feeling this warm sense of contentment that should have been a warning, because in my family, contentment never lasted long. Jake was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner booth with that wide smile he wore when he was particularly pleased with himself, and I slid into the seat across from him thinking, maybe today would be different. Maybe today we could just have a normal lunch like normal siblings who actually enjoyed each other's company. We ordered burgers and fries, made small talk about work and his upcoming anniversary trip with Sarah, and I started to relax into the rhythm of ordinary conversation until the food arrived, and I noticed Jake watching me with this barely contained excitement that made my stomach clench with familiar dread. But the burger looked amazing and I was starving, and I told myself I was being paranoid, that not everything was a prank, that sometimes a lunch was just a lunch. I took a big bite, and for a few seconds everything was fine. The flavors were good. The burger was juicy and perfectly cooked, and then something started to feel wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. My mouth began to tingle, not unpleasantly at first, just this weird buzzing sensation that made me think maybe I'd bitten my tongue without realizing it, but then the tingling intensified, spread to my lips, my tongue, the roof of my mouth, and I looked up at Jake and saw him grinning. Actually grinning. And I knew with absolute certainty that he'd done something to my food. The tingling became burning. My throat started to feel tight, and I tried to ask him what he'd done, but my voice came out strangled and wrong, and suddenly I couldn't swallow properly, and panic started to rise in my chest like floodwater. Jake was laughing now, telling me it was just a little hot sauce. Relax, it's just a prank. But nothing about what was happening to my body felt like just anything, and I knew something was terribly, horribly wrong in a way that transcended any prank he'd ever pulled before. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt weak, and the room tilted sideways, and Jake's laughter finally stopped as he seemed to register that I wasn't faking, that this wasn't me being dramatic or oversensitive, that something genuinely bad was happening to his little sister right in front of him. My throat was closing up. I could feel it narrowing with every passing second, and breathing was becoming harder and harder, like trying to suck air through a straw that kept getting smaller and smaller. I managed to gasp out the word allergic. Though I didn't know what I was allergic to, I'd never had a food allergy in my life, but something in whatever Jake had put in my burger was triggering a reaction my body couldn't handle. People in the restaurant were starting to notice, were standing up and staring, and someone was calling 911 while Jake kept saying, oh my God, I didn't know, I swear I didn't know. But his words felt distant and unimportant compared to the very real terror of not being able to breathe, of feeling my airway constrict with every passing moment. I clawed at my throat like I could somehow manually open it up, like I could force air into my lungs through sheer willpower, and my vision started to blur around the edges, and I thought with startling clarity, this is how I die. This is how my story ends. Killed by my brother's idea of a joke in a burger restaurant on a beautiful autumn Tuesday. The paramedics arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, bursting through the restaurant door with their equipment and their calm, professional voices, asking me questions I couldn't answer because I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but focus every ounce of energy on the simple act of staying conscious. They got me onto the floor, started working on me with an efficiency that would have been comforting if I wasn't so terrified, And I heard words like anaphylaxis and epinephrine and airway compromise floating above me like dialogue from a medical drama, except this was my life, my body, my mortality hanging in the balance. The epinephrine injection felt like fire spreading through my veins, but almost immediately I could breathe a little easier, the crushing pressure on my chest easing just enough that I could pull in a shallow breath, then another, and the paramedic's face came into focus above me telling me I was going to be okay. They were taking me to the hospital, just stay calm and keep breathing. They loaded me onto the gurney and I caught a glimpse of Jake's face as they wheeled me past him, pale and shocked and completely stripped of that cocky confidence he always wore like armor. And in that moment I felt nothing for him. Not anger, not love, not even betrayal. Just a vast emptiness where our relationship used to be. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and worried faces and medical equipment beeping around me, the paramedics monitoring my vitals and asking questions about my medical history and what I'd eaten, and all I could think about was how stupid I'd been to trust Jake, to believe that this lunch would be different, to keep giving him chances when he'd shown me over and over again exactly who he was, and how little he valued my well-being compared to getting a laugh. We arrived at the hospital, and suddenly I was being wheeled through bright corridors past rooms full of other people's emergencies, into a trauma bay where doctors and nurses swarmed around me asking the same questions the paramedics had asked, starting IVs, hooking me up to monitors, giving me more medications whose names I didn't catch and didn't care about as long as they kept my throat open and air moving in and out of my lungs. The attending physician, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, explained that I was having a severe allergic reaction, that they'd gotten to me in time, that I was going to be okay, but they needed to monitor me for several hours to make sure the reaction didn't rebound once the epinephrine wore off. She asked what I'd eaten, and I told her about the burger, about Jake, about how he'd put something in my food as a prank, and I watched her expression shift from professional concern to barely contained anger as she processed what I was telling her, that someone had deliberately contaminated my food and triggered this life-threatening reaction. They admitted me for observation, moved me to a regular room once I was stable, and I lay in that hospital bed with IVs in my arms and monitors beeping rhythmically around me, staring at the ceiling tiles and trying to process what had just happened to me. Jake showed up about an hour later, sheepish and apologetic and full of explanations about how he'd just put some super spicy pepper extract in my burger as a joke, how he didn't know I was allergic, how he felt terrible and would never have done it if he'd known. He stood at the foot of my bed wringing his hands and apologizing over and over, and I listened to him without saying a word, because what could I possibly say that would convey the magnitude of what he'd done, the violation of putting something in my food without my knowledge or consent, the fundamental betrayal of my trust and my safety for the sake of a laugh he could share with his friends later. Have you ever been so angry that you loop back around to calm, to this icy clarity where you can see everything with perfect precision? That's where I was as I looked at my brother and realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was the inevitable conclusion of a lifetime of boundary violations that I'd enabled by laughing along, by being the cool sister who could take a joke, by prioritizing family harmony over my own dignity and well-being. Comment below if you've ever had someone in your life who kept pushing until they finally pushed too far. The doctor came in while Jake was still there and explained in detail what had happened to my body, how the capsaicin from the ghost pepper extract Jake had used had triggered an immediate and severe allergic reaction, how my throat had swollen, how my blood pressure had dropped, how without immediate medical intervention I could have died right there in that restaurant. She said the words could have died very calmly, very matter-of-factly, the way doctors do when they're stating medical realities, and I watched those words land on Jake like physical blows, watched him process the fact that his prank could have killed me, actually killed me, ended my life permanently over a joke he thought would be funny. The doctor continued, explaining that I'd need to carry an EpiPen from now on, that I'd need to avoid all foods containing capsaicin, that I'd need to be hyper-vigilant about what I ate and who prepared it because now I had a documented severe allergy that could be triggered again with potentially fatal results. She left us alone after that, and Jake tried again to apologize, to explain, to somehow make this okay, but I just turned my head away and told him to leave, my voice flat and empty of emotion, and after a moment of hesitation he did, slinking out of the room like a dog who'd been caught doing something wrong but didn't quite understand what. I spent the night in the hospital for observation, drifting in and out of restless sleep filled with nightmares of choking and drowning and calling for help that never came. And when morning finally arrived, I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left only this brittle shell behind. The doctors did final checks, confirmed I was stable, gave me prescriptions for EpiPens and antihistamines, and a stern lecture about avoiding my trigger foods. And then I was discharged into a world that felt fundamentally different than the one I'd left the day before. My best friend Mia picked me up, took one look at my face and didn't ask questions, just drove me home and helped me into my apartment and sat with me while I stared at the wall and tried to figure out how to move forward from this. Over the next few days, as my body recovered from the trauma of the reaction and the medications, I had a lot of time to think, to really examine my relationship with Jake and with my family, and with my own complicity in allowing this dynamic to continue for so long. I thought about all the times I'd laughed when I didn't think something was funny, all the times I'd minimized my own hurt feelings to keep the peace, all the times I'd let Jake off the hook for behavior that crossed lines I didn't even know I was allowed to draw. My parents called, of course, because Jake had told them what happened, but their concern felt performative, focused more on making sure I wasn't going to make a big deal out of this than on my actual well-being. My mother kept saying things like accidents happen, and Jake feels terrible, and you know he'd never intentionally hurt you. And I listened to her make excuses for him the way she'd been making excuses for him our entire lives. And something in me finally snapped. I wasn't a child anymore who needed parental approval to know that what happened to me was wrong, and I wasn't going to let them gaslight me into believing this was somehow my fault for being too sensitive or not being able to take a joke. I told my mother very calmly that Jake had poisoned me, that he'd put something in my food without my knowledge or consent, that I'd nearly died because of his actions, and that I needed space to process what had happened before I could talk about forgiveness or moving forward. She didn't like that answer, tried to argue, tried to guilt me into letting this go for the sake of family unity, but I held firm in a way I'd never been able to before, and eventually she gave up and said she'd give me time but hoped I'd come to my senses soon. The medical bills started arriving about 2 weeks later, and opening those envelopes felt like being violated all over again, being forced to confront the tangible financial cost of Jake's prank in stark black and white numbers. The ambulance ride alone was $1,800, and that was just the beginning. The emergency room treatment, the medications, the observation stay, the follow-up appointments, it all added up to a total that made me feel physically sick when I calculated it. $23,467.38 to be exact, because I'm the kind of person who adds things up to the penny, who needs to know exactly what something costs even when the number is devastating. I had health insurance, thank God, but my deductible was high and my coverage was the basic plan that covered emergencies, but left me responsible for a huge chunk of the costs. And even after insurance, I was looking at paying over $8,000 out of pocket for medical treatment I'd only needed, because my brother thought it would be funny to spike my food with something my body interpreted as a deadly threat. $8,000 might not sound like much to some people, but to a freelance graphic designer living paycheck to paycheck in an expensive city, it was catastrophic. It was several months of rent. It was my entire emergency savings wiped out plus debt I'd have to take on, and all of it because Jake couldn't resist playing a prank. I sat with those bills spread out on my coffee table for hours, just staring at them, feeling the weight of this financial burden that had been thrust upon me through no fault of my own. And that's when the idea first occurred to me. Why should I pay for this? Why should I be the one to shoulder the financial consequences of Jake's actions when he was the one who'd put me in the hospital? I knew what my family would say. Knew they'd tell me that suing Jake or demanding he pay my medical bills would be vindictive and petty, and that it would destroy our family. But sitting there looking at those bills, I realized something important. Jake had already destroyed our family, or at least the version of it I'd been clinging to. The one where we were all supposed to love and support each other no matter what. You can't love someone and deliberately put their life in danger for a laugh, and you can't claim to support someone while simultaneously violating every boundary they have. The family I thought I had was an illusion, a story I'd been telling myself to make sense of a dynamic that had never actually served me, and maybe it was time to stop protecting that illusion and start protecting myself instead. Have you ever reached a point where you realized you had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect? That's where I was. And for the first time in my life, I chose myself. I decided to send Jake the medical bills, all of them, with a formal letter requesting reimbursement for the full amount I owed after insurance. But I didn't stop there, because something about just sending the bills felt incomplete, felt like it didn't adequately capture the full scope of what his actions had cost me, beyond just money. So I did something that might seem petty to some people, but felt like justice to me. I calculated interest. I researched what courts typically award in personal injury cases, looked up the going rate for pain and suffering, for emotional distress, for the ongoing medical costs of having to carry EpiPens everywhere, and modify my diet and live with the constant anxiety of knowing I had a severe allergy that could be triggered at any time. I'm not a lawyer and I wasn't trying to build a legal case. I just wanted Jake to understand that actions have consequences, that you can't nearly kill someone and walk away without any accountability just because you share DNA in a childhood. I calculated 12 months of interest at a rate comparable to credit card debt, since that's what I'd have to use if I couldn't pay these bills. Added a conservative estimate for pain and suffering that didn't even begin to cover the trauma of thinking I was going to die on a restaurant floor, and came up with a total that was significantly higher than the original medical costs, but still felt inadequate to capture what I'd lost. The final bill I sent to Jake came to just over $15,000, itemized carefully with explanations for every charge, every addition, every calculation that went into that number. I attached copies of all the medical bills, highlighted the relevant charges, included a cover letter explaining calmly and factually what had happened and why I believed he was responsible for these costs. I didn't yell or accuse or get emotional in the letter. I just laid out the facts like I was presenting a business proposal. And maybe that coldness, that detachment, communicated my anger more effectively than any amount of screaming could have. I mailed the package to Jake's house on a Monday morning, certified mail so I'd know when he received it, and then I waited for the explosion I knew was coming. It arrived 2 days later, in the form of a phone call from Jake that went straight to voicemail because I didn't answer, his voice on the recording oscillating between disbelief and anger as he demanded to know if I was serious, if I'd really sent him a bill, if I was actually trying to extort money from him over an accident. The word accident made me so angry I had to put my phone down and walk away from it, because what happened to me wasn't an accident. An accident is something that occurs despite precautions, despite care, despite good intentions, and what Jake did was deliberate, intentional. A choice he made to prioritize his amusement over my safety and well-being. The calls and texts kept coming, from Jake, from my parents, from Jake's wife Sarah, who I'd always gotten along with and who now seemed to think I was being unreasonable and cruel, from extended family members who'd somehow heard about the situation and felt entitled to weigh in with their opinions about family loyalty and forgiveness. Everyone had something to say about my decision to send Jake that bill, and almost universally they thought I was wrong. Thought I was taking things too far, thought I was being vindictive and destroying the family over something that was essentially a harmless prank that got out of hand. No one seemed to understand or care that I'd nearly died, that I was now saddled with both medical debt and lifelong medical complications because of Jake's actions, that this wasn't about revenge but about basic accountability and respect for the fact that I was a human being whose life and well-being should matter more than Jake's reputation or the family's comfort. My mother left me a voicemail that I did listen to, crying and begging me to reconsider, saying that Jake had made a mistake and was sorry and that demanding money from him was just going to make everything worse. She said that I was tearing the family apart, that Thanksgiving was coming up and how could we all sit around the same table with this hanging over us, and I remember listening to her voice break as she pleaded with me to just let this go, to be the bigger person, to think about the family. But here's what my mother and everyone else didn't seem to understand. I was thinking about the family, or at least about the kind of family I wanted to be part of, the kind of family where people were held accountable for their actions instead of being coddled and excused and enabled to keep hurting each other in the name of keeping the peace. I called my mother back and I told her very clearly that I wasn't tearing the family apart. Jake did that when he decided a laugh was more important than my life, and that if the family couldn't survive me setting boundaries and demanding accountability, then maybe it wasn't as strong or as healthy as we all pretended it was. I told her I loved her, that I loved all of them, but that love couldn't be unconditional when it came at the cost of my safety and my sanity and my financial security. I told her I was done being the family punching bag, done being the butt of every joke, done prioritizing everyone else's comfort over my own basic right to be treated with respect and dignity. And then I told her I wouldn't be coming to Thanksgiving or Christmas or any family gathering until Jake took responsibility for what he'd done, not just with words but with actions, by paying the bill I'd sent him and acknowledging that what he did was wrong, not just unfortunate or accidental, but fundamentally, unforgivably wrong. The silence that followed that conversation was deafening, and in some ways harder to bear than all the angry calls and guilt-tripping texts had been, because silence meant I'd really done it. I'd really drawn a line in the sand and forced my family to choose sides. I won't lie and say I didn't have moments of doubt. Nights where I lay awake wondering if I was being too harsh, if I should just forgive Jake and move on and let the medical bills bankrupt me in service of family harmony. But then I'd remember the feeling of my throat closing up, the terror of not being able to breathe, The absolute helplessness of being poisoned by someone who was supposed to love and protect me. And I'd know that I was doing the right thing even if it was the hard thing, even if it cost me relationships I'd valued, even if it meant being alone during holidays and family celebrations I'd never missed before. My friend Mia was incredible during this time, checking on me constantly, reminding me that I deserved to be treated better, that setting boundaries didn't make me a bad person or a bad sister, that people who truly loved me would respect my limits instead of trampling them. She helped me see that the guilt I was feeling had been conditioned into me over years of being told that family loyalty meant tolerating abuse, and that unlearning that conditioning was going to be uncomfortable but necessary if I ever wanted to have healthy relationships. About a month after I sent the bill, I got a text from Jake that was different from all his previous angry, defensive messages. It was short, just a few lines, and it said that he'd thought about what I'd said, that he'd talked to a therapist about his behavior patterns, and that he was starting to understand that what he'd done to me wasn't a prank but assault, that putting something in someone's food without their knowledge is a violation regardless of intent. He said he was sorry, really sorry in a way he hadn't been before when he was still defending himself and minimizing what happened, and he asked if we could meet to talk. I didn't respond right away because I needed time to process this shift, to figure out if it was genuine or just another manipulation tactic, another way to try to get me to back down and make this easier for him. I talked to Mia, talked to my own therapist, who I'd started seeing to help process the trauma of the allergic reaction and the family fallout, and eventually I decided that I was willing to meet with Jake, but on my terms, in a public place, with clear boundaries about what I needed from him if we were ever going to have any kind of relationship going forward. We met at a coffee shop, neutral territory where I felt safe and in control, and Jake looked different than I'd ever seen him. Smaller somehow, like the consequences of his actions had actually penetrated that armor of confidence he usually wore. He apologized again, more thoroughly this time, acknowledging specifically that he'd violated my consent, that he'd prioritized getting a laugh over my safety, that he'd been doing this kind of thing to me our whole lives and had never stopped to consider how it affected me because our family had always told him it was fine, that I was just being sensitive, that it was all in good fun. He said he was working with his therapist to understand why he needed to humiliate others to feel good about himself, why he'd never learned to respect boundaries, why he'd been so resistant to taking responsibility when his prank had almost killed me. And then he said the words I'd been waiting to hear. He pulled out his checkbook and asked how much he owed me, not arguing about the amount or trying to negotiate it down, just accepting that this was his debt to pay. I told him the $15,000 total, watched him write the check without flinching, and when he handed it to me, I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite forgiveness, but maybe the possibility of it someday. The acknowledgement that he was finally taking accountability for what he'd done. But I didn't let him off easy. Didn't smile and tell him everything was fine now that he'd paid the bill, because money alone couldn't fix what was broken between us. I told him that the check was the bare minimum, the absolute baseline of accountability, and that if he wanted any kind of relationship with me going forward, he needed to commit to respecting my boundaries, to never pulling pranks on me again, to actually seeing me as a person worthy of respect, instead of a prop for his amusement. I told him I needed him to acknowledge to our parents and to the rest of the family what he'd done, not to humiliate him, but because I was tired of being made out to be the villain for demanding basic decency, and I needed them to understand that my response to his actions was justified and reasonable. Jake agreed to all of it, though I could see it cost him something to make those promises, cost him that image of himself as the fun-loving prankster who never meant any harm. We didn't hug when we parted ways, didn't make plans to get together again soon, but there was a possibility hanging between us that hadn't existed before, a small, fragile hope that maybe we could build something new from the ruins of what his prank had destroyed. The aftermath of all this has been complicated in ways I couldn't have anticipated when I first made the decision to send Jake that bill. My relationship with my parents is still strained, still marked by their disappointment that I didn't just sweep this under the rug the way our family has always swept uncomfortable things under the rug, but I've accepted that their approval isn't something I need anymore, that I can love them and still maintain boundaries with them, still refuse to participate in dynamics that harm me. Some extended family members stopped talking to me altogether, decided I was too difficult or too dramatic or too unwilling to play nice, and I've made peace with losing those relationships because what I gained was so much more valuable. Self-respect, boundaries, the knowledge that I can survive being disliked if it means being true to myself. Jake and I are slowly, carefully rebuilding some kind of connection, though it looks nothing like what we had before and probably never will. And I'm okay with that because what we had before was toxic and unsustainable and built on me accepting treatment I should never have tolerated. He's been true to his word about respecting my boundaries, about not pulling pranks, about actually considering my feelings before he acts. And while I'm still wary, still waiting for him to revert to his old patterns, I'm also allowing myself to hope that maybe he really is changing, really is becoming someone who can have healthy relationships based on mutual respect. The medical debt is paid off now, thanks to Jake's check and my own careful budgeting. And I no longer wake up in a panic about how I'm going to cover those costs while still paying rent and buying groceries. I carry EpiPens everywhere I go, have become hyper-vigilant about asking what's in food before I eat it, have had to have uncomfortable conversations with friends and dates about my allergy and why I can't just trust that food is safe, and these are realities I'll live with for the rest of my life because of what Jake did to me. But I've also gained something I didn't have before: absolute clarity about my worth and my right to demand better treatment from the people in my life. I've learned that it's okay to prioritize my safety and well-being over other people's comfort, that setting boundaries isn't selfish or mean but necessary for any healthy relationship, that love without respect is just a cage disguised as connection. I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought, capable of standing alone if necessary, capable of weathering family rejection and social disapproval if it means honoring my own truth and protecting my own peace. So here I am now, months after that terrible Tuesday that changed everything, and I want you to understand something important. This story isn't about revenge or pettiness or refusing to forgive, even though that's how some people have characterized my decision to send Jake that medical bill with interest. This story is about accountability, about the radical act of insisting that people who harm you, even family members, especially family members, face real consequences for their actions. It's about understanding that forgiveness doesn't mean absorbing the cost of someone else's mistakes, that being the bigger person doesn't mean making yourself smaller to accommodate someone else's dysfunction, that family loyalty goes both ways and shouldn't require you to light yourself on fire to keep others warm. I'm sharing this story because I think we don't talk enough about the invisible contracts we enter into with family, the unspoken rules that say we have to accept certain behaviors, tolerate certain violations, forgive certain harms just because we share blood or history or a last name. I'm sharing this because someone out there needs to know that it's okay to break those contracts when they're hurting you, okay to demand better, okay to walk away from relationships that diminish you, even if those relationships are supposed to be sacred and unbreakable. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between family harmony and your own well-being? Have you ever had to set a boundary that everyone told you was too harsh, too unforgiving, too much? I want you to know that your boundaries are valid. Your feelings are valid. Your right to protect yourself is valid even when the people around you are telling you that you're overreacting, or being too sensitive, or taking things too seriously. I want you to know that it's not your job to manage other people's emotions or shield them from the natural consequences of their actions, even if those people are your parents or siblings or people you've loved your entire life. Your safety, your peace of mind. These things matter. They matter more than keeping up appearances or maintaining the illusion of a perfect family, or making sure everyone else is comfortable at your expense. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise, and don't let guilt or obligation or the fear of being alone keep you trapped in situations that harm you. You deserve better, and demanding better doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a person who finally understands their own worth. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from you because your stories and experiences matter just as much as mine does. Have you ever had someone close to you cross a serious boundary? How did you handle it? Did you demand accountability, or did you let it go to keep the peace? I know these situations are never simple, never black and white, and I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below because we learn from each other's experiences, and sometimes just knowing we're not alone in struggling with these impossible choices makes all the difference. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships and boundaries, if it helped you feel less alone in standing up for yourself even when everyone around you is telling you to back down, please leave a like on this video because it helps more people find this content and maybe helps someone else who desperately needs to hear that it's okay to prioritize themselves for once. And if you want to hear more stories like this, more honest conversations about the messy, complicated reality of family relationships and personal boundaries and the courage it takes to choose yourself, please subscribe to Living Through It and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. I share new stories every week, stories about real people navigating real challenges and coming out the other side changed but intact, and I'd love to have you as part of this community. Thank you so much for listening to my story, for giving me space to share this experience that fundamentally altered who I am and how I move through the world. And remember, you're allowed to protect yourself. You're allowed to demand respect. You're allowed to set boundaries even with people you love, especially with people you love. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you in the next video.